Salvete omnes, and welcome to the final unit in text for Latin 202. For the last unit, and this will be the basis of the final exam, about which we'll talk more later, we're going to sample one of the more famous stories in Latin literature, namely Ovid's Narcissus and Echo. I will indicate per email. I will ask you to stop by and pick up a glossary with some description of the text, its vocabulary, and its literary significance, which I encourage you to do, given the fact that this is unadapted Latin and translation is just that, an interpretation. And indeed, if you were to translate or to look up different translations of Ovid's original text, you would note different translations. Indeed, I encourage you to do so in order to get a sense of the art of translation and how an interpretation informs the choices that a translator makes. So we're going to take a look at this story here. We're not going to be able to go through all of it. In fact, I'll indicate at some point we will read the rest of the story in English, just given our time constraints, but we will certainly read enough where hopefully you'll have a sense of the original text and appreciate its literary artistic brilliance. So we're talking about lines 339 to 510. This is in book 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. You can research the biographical background for the text and Ovid's life, but he is considered one of the great writers in Latin literature and ranks right up there with Virgil, Horace, and Catullus in terms of literary Latin and the so-called Golden Age. So we're going to jump right into it, just given the online format. Makes more sense to just to go right into the text without using other text or images that we would undoubtedly do if we were in the classroom as a kind of introduction to the Latin. We always want to start with the title, of course. Narcissism is a term that is used in psychology and has been the subject of a lot of different commentary and usage throughout Western literature and thought. Certainly in art, you can see, if you just browse through Google Images, you'll see many famous renditions and interpretations of the story. A couple other interesting examples. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, talked a lot about narcissism in his interpretation of the human mind and human psychology and human desire. And then another, perhaps more recent and yet different, would be Christopher Lasch's interpretation of contemporary American culture called The Culture of Narcissism. Christopher Lasch, Lasch, which is an interesting read still today. And what do we mean, just kind of looking at this image right here that I'm toggling over, is narcissism, of course, is the figure, but it suggests some kind of self-absorption accompanied by self-awareness, which is a kind of forgetfulness that one's own awareness is part of a larger awareness in human consciousness that we might call reality or the world or otherness. And this particular story, invented by Ovid, can be read on many levels. We can only suggest some of these levels in this format in the coming short videos that we'll be creating for you. But I would encourage you to be thinking about other meanings, because as part of your final exam, you'll have to write a short interpretive essay in English about the story and its psychological, literary, moral, and even existential significance. So with that said, let's take a look at the text itself. And again, we're not going to be going over the entire text today, just as a kind of introduction to this. So this story, I'm just using Latin library, so this is not divided in a more scholarly publication. There might be a division here between 338 and 339, and perhaps even a title, Narcissus and Echo. In this particular online version, we do not have that. So it starts off with Ille per Ionies fama celeberrimus urbes in reprehensa dabat popula responsa petenti. Prima fide vocisque ratae temptamina sumpsit caerula liriope, quam quondam flumine curvo implicuit clausaeque suis cafisos in undos vium tulit. Enexa es utero pocerrima pleno infanatam nymphae, iam tunc nuqui posset amare narcissumque vocat. So we're going to make a kind of stop right here, just because you'll see this is kind of a story within a story. Indeed, the entire Metamorphoses can be read in that manner. So then we have to do, the hard work of reading and interpretation and translation, and in particular, of course, knowing the vocabulary words. And given the fact that this is unadapted Latin, there'll be many sort of questions about syntax, just because classical Latin and modern English use different grammatical conventions and styles to communicate meaning. One of the key differences, of course, between Latin and English is how periphrastic Latin is. That is to say, Latin loves to use passive, often will drop the subject, and because it's an inflected language, it often will not have a separate finite subject, but rather the single word can be both the subject and the verb. And so Latin tends to have less vocabulary, if by that we mean a verbatim one-to-one equivalency between the two languages. So that requires obviously some developed sense of how Latin works, which you have at this point, considering you're in Latin 202. You're sort of familiar with this by now. And then also just using your imagination and understanding that ultimately, if you're living in ancient Rome, we've talked about this before, we're not translating. So if you're a Roman student, living in the first century, you're not translating, you're reading in Latin. Similarly, in English, we're not translating into French, we're reading in English. And what that means is reading comprehension, and that itself, of course, is a complex subject, but certainly one sensible way to describe and even define comprehension is we have some image that words are creating, and those images create the meaning. So we have both the letter and the spirit in the language. So ille is a demonstrative pronoun, and again, I do have my Whitaker's words out here. So if I wanted to, I'm not going to do it for this one because this one is fairly straightforward. But as always, you'll have to get out your dictionary and look up the words if you have forgotten what they mean. But this one is fairly common at this point. You've probably had it many times since you first started learning Latin. We don't have a context here for who this is. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, since I'm familiar with the background to this particular story. Ille is Tiresias, Tiresias. And Tiresias is a kind of blind wise man, a kind of literary trope that is scattered here and there um, in classical literature. And so if I were, this is the disadvantage of the online format, is this is kind of clumsy to do this, but just to show you where I'm going with this, is you can see that in mythology, he goes all the way back, to the ancient authors, for example, Sophocles, Euripides, and also Ovid. And over here, just to kind of use kind of a general description, in Greek mythology, Tiresias was a blind prophet of Apollo in Thebes, famous for his clairvoyance and for being transformed into a woman for 7 years. As you know, with Greeks in mythology, they tend to be very mercurial and take on different personas and different functions. But Ovid uses him because ancient writers, ancient educated persons would have been familiar with his figure. So Tiresias is our subject, and then per Ionias is through Aeonia. Now, Aeonia, of course, or Ionia, depending how you want to translate it here, this is, as you may recall, often considered the dividing line, spiritually and culturally speaking, between East and West. For example, Greek philosophy is often said to come from Ionia and the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. For example, Parmenides or Heraclitus, who often spoke in kind of oracular terms before Socrates humanized philosophy, and as Cicero famously said, brought philosophy down from the heavens to the earth. But here it works out nice because this is a kind of myth, and the fact that you'll see that the language of Tiresias is somewhat elusive, that's because he's not completely rational, as one might say in a Platonic, Socratic sense. At the same time, he's sort of linked to the mystical tradition of language, which certainly literary writers like Ovid are going to find perhaps more appealing for a lot of reasons than the more conceptually driven language of philosophers, for example, in Plato and Aristotle. So with that said, is ille per Ionies fama celeberrimus urbes imprehensa dabat populo responsa petenti. As you know, the challenge, well, there's many challenges, but I think English likes that verb early in the sentence. If we say he, well, he was what, or he is what, or he had done what. And so English, especially the way we understand it, as you know, is we prefer that verb earlier, whereas Latin being an inflected language, it doesn't operate that way. Here we have to be able to recognize that this is the verb that agrees with the subject. Now, how do we know that? Well, this is where careful analysis of the clause, so we want to use punctuation to help us separate the syntax, otherwise it can kind of all run together and be perhaps a little bit confusing. So if we analyze the other parts of speech, well, so here's a demonstrative pronoun. This is a preposition. This is a plural form of the noun, which could be that, but normally the fact that, as we'll see in a second, was giving, this is singular, this is plural, plus per Ionias, we have to sort of sense that syntax goes together. Fama is an adjective, so an adjective can't be a noun. And then here is an adverb. Here we have a noun in the plural. And then here we have another participial adjective word, which cannot be the subject. And then here we have some dative endings, populus, populo, so second declension, dative singular is O. Here we have a participle in the third declension, dative singular. And then here we have another participle. So since this is unadapted Latin, It's a little bit trickier than some of the textbook Latin that you may have had thus far, but just kind of going through the sentence here, or the clause, and looking at the endings, we only have a couple options for the subject and the verb, and that is often the case at some point requires judgment. That's no different than in the more stem cell related fields, is you can learn all the facts in the world, but if you don't know how to apply them through analysis and understanding and judgment, then in one sense you're not really a scientist in any meaningful sense. So it's no different in language studies, as we can look up the words, but at some point human judgment has to take control and try to make sense of it. So he was giving. So dabat is imperfect, do, dare, dedi, datum. So he was giving, and then, well, giving what? Well, this is where we have to recognize that responses, but then these are irreprehensible. What does that mean? That means that they're not able to be responded to. So he was giving irreprehensible responses, but then you give responses to people. So here's our dative indirect object. And then notice these people are asking. So like a petition, peto, petare, petavi, petatum. So the people are asking him questions, is the sense here. But then notice the people don't really understand because of his sort of wise man status, if you will, his oracular status. They don't really understand the answers that he's giving. And where is he giving these answers? Well, he's giving them in the city. And so we put all together is that he, and then literally his fame having spread quickly. So celeberimos means quickly. So his fame having spread quickly through Ionia, was giving incomprehensible answers to people who were asking. So again, I'm not going to do it on this format, but one of the things you'll have to do, I believe, otherwise you might, this is, doing unadapted Latin online like this is a little bit trickier than the easier textbook Latin, but we're going to persevere with it. You're going to have to look up a translation, and again, I would encourage you to compare some well-known translations, and then use that just to give you a little bit of confidence in your own understanding of the text. But again, the way I teach Latin is not translation, because I don't think any of us are going to become professional translators of Latin, but rather we're taking it for an appreciation of a foreign language. So with that said, as I've said many times, I think our goal is comprehension, that ideally when you study something, it should change the way you think. And so studying Latin or any foreign language should, assuming one is serious in learning it, should change the way we think about language, and how sometimes it's difficult, for example, to translate between one language and another. And that may be because that's what morality is. Morality is not reducing everything to one language. For example, clearly the absurd, immoral thought that we're just going to reduce everything to English translation would be quite a boring, immoral world, a world of tyranny, a world of lack of difference, a world where freedom doesn't exist, and quite frankly, a world which could not be changed because one has already absolutized the contingencies and ephemeralities of human existence, which is, in one sense, the inescapable condition of all thought and language and being. So he was giving incomprehensible answers, or rather his fame having spread quickly through the cities, was giving irreprehensible answers to people who were asking. The first So prima fide. Um, Temptimina sumsit, which means basically to, we have to look at this as a phrasal verb. So sumo means to take or to take up. So literally to take up the trial or to take, I mean, almost suggestively to take up the temptation. What kind of temptation? Well, of trying to figure out what he's saying. So the first, to make trial um, of literally the faithful pronouncements of Tiresias. So that so as often this is a transition. So as I was saying earlier, we're moving from one story previously in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Remember, this is 12 books total, so many stories within it. So we're making a transition from that one story to the other. That's why this is a little bit difficult to try to explain in this format. This would be much easier to explain if we were in the classroom. Um, so he, or rather, the first to make trial of literally of the voice um, of the verified voice. So you have to kind of maybe put that in more idiomatic English, is the first to test the fidelity or to test the words of Tiresias. In fact, that's sort of what it means here, because this idea that his words were ratified, that just it's kind of awkward to translate here. But again, when you look up translations of this, you'll see what I mean. And then here is the person who, or not the person, but the figure who's asking Tiresias was the nymph Liriope. As you know, in mythology, a nymph is a kind of naiad or a kind of mermaid, if you might even say, although mythology is a little bit different than in Disney. But she is a water nymph, and she is the first to ask Tiresias a question and to see if she can kind of figure out what the people have not been able to figure out. So she was the first. So there's our subject, and then we know it's the subject based on the context, and then our verb is in the third person singular. So the first to test the accuracy of the words of Tiresias was the water nymph Liriope. Quam means whom, referring back to Liriope. And then quandam means once. And then already right here, if we say whom once, we expect some person to be involved. And that is the river god Kephisos. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and as I'll indicate in email, I will be giving you, so I think everybody but Sophie will receive this when you take your second test. Sophie, we'll make arrangements for you to get a copy as well. But I have a handout for you that accompanies the language and will explain many of these figures. For example, it talks about how this is Tiresias. And it talks about how Liriope is a nymph and what that is. Here it talks about the river god Kephisos. So just be patient when you get that and use that handout. That will help serve as an additional guide through the language. So whom wants the river god, or just whom wants Kephisos, who's a river god. And then our verb here is implicuit. Now this is where we get the word to implicate, which is kind of a legal term, is to get somebody, suggest a kind of involvement with some crime or whatnot. Somebody's implicated in the crime. But here it just means that grasped, or as you'll see, that Kephisos took in his claws, literally in his, so he grabbed her, and he took her tulit by force, literally under the waves. So he grabbed her by force, um, in a kind of winding, spiraling, in a kind of turbulent river. I think of a river that's kind of maybe it's like a whirlpool type action, literally curvo flumine, literally in a curvious river. And so we have to have this image that the nymph Liriope was grabbed by Cephisus and taken by force into the river. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. For our purposes, what it does is it links up with one of the constant larger themes in Ovid's Metamorphoses more generally, namely that change often originates in violence. There's some kind of transformation. You may be familiar with maybe when you studied Latin in high school or your other studies of Latin with the story of Actaeon, also told by Ovid in that story, Actaeon, Actaeon. He stumbles across Diana, the goddess Diana, and her attendants. And of course, Diana, as you may recall, turns Actaeon into a stag or a deer. And when he returns to his pack of dogs don't recognize him because they're out hunting for deer or whatnot. And they tear him to pieces, namely, they tear their own unknown master into pieces. And so this idea of something happening by force, whether the gods, think of other examples in Greek mythology where think of Io, for example, and just think how cruel Juno, and because of Zeus, but just think how cruel, think what kind of cruelty happens to Io by the gods in terms of her torment and suffering. So your general knowledge of Greek mythology, will alert you to the fact that the Greeks were kind of a mixed bag, quite frankly, in terms of their morality towards human beings, and Ovid seemingly is continuing that theme. Now, here, so now because we're kind of into the transition, hopefully it's getting a little bit clearer, but again, you're still going to have to look up the words. Anixa est means was born. So if this is figuratively speaking, but this is where you're just going to have to look up words. But here's our, see what I mean, is gave birth to. So here's our participle, bring forth, bear, give birth to. So we have to sort of keep that in mind when we go back to this. And so who was born? Well, there was an infant from the nymph. Now, the nymph, of course, is going back to Caerula Liriope. And again, the notes that I will give you as a hard copy will explain this. So, literally, born was from uterus, most beautiful, full infant by nymph. So, what is it saying is that because of the violent actions of Cephisus, that Liriope gave birth to a beautiful infant. And when he was born from her uterus, he was full born from her uterus already as a most beautiful infant, from the nymph. Already now, who was able to be loved, called Narcissus. So we put all together is that a beautiful infant was, a most beautiful infant was born from the uterus of the nymph, whom one now already was able to love, called Narcissus. Now the idea here, of course, is that it is Narcissus's beauty that in his love for himself, in his own image of himself, in other words, he's drawn by his own beauty, that of course it later informs the tragic nature of the poem. Or not the poem, but the story. So let's take a look here, just to kind of bring this together here. So if we just pull up, let's see, Ovid, Narcissus, Echo, translation. Oops, if I can type there. And as you can imagine, there's many, many different kinds of translations. But we'll use this one. What I do recommend is you choose one and then kind of stick with it. Otherwise, the styles are going to be a little bit different. And so you can see the judgment of Tiresias. That was the transition. So we didn't read that story. That's why the first couple lines were a little bit choppy. But these are the elements that we're going to be reading. We're going to be reading, in fact, this one is called Poetry and Translation. I like this site because it breaks apart lines 339 to 510. So these are the different parts of the story we're going to be reading. And again, we're probably not going to get through all of them. So we'll do maybe 3, and then the other 2 we would just read in translation because we're going to run out of time by the end of the semester. So this part is Echo sees Narcissus, which we haven't gotten to yet. How Juno altered Echo's speech. So here the gods are involved in being cruel to man. Narcissus sees himself and falls in love. Narcissus laments the pain of unrequited love. Narcissus is changed into a flower. So let's take a look at this here. And then famous throughout all the Ionian cities. So let's take a look at that right here. In fact, I would encourage you to print this out. In fact, this is actually a solitary intellectual exercise because, as you can imagine, I'll give an example that might be more familiar, or maybe not. But as you know, Luther is famous for translating the Bible into German. And that's why he was a genius, is he really didn't have any other examples of that text being translated from Greek into German. But certainly other writers after Luther have compared his translation to their own. And so they use Luther's famous translation to perhaps improve upon it, maybe make it more contemporary, more modern. But they're still using that source by Luther. Well, it's similar in scholarship for Latin, is that this translation right here, which seems pretty good, I guarantee you this person didn't just sit down and translate it. This person looked at many, many other famous translations throughout the centuries in order to, one, help the translator understand what he or she's reading in the original, and 2, to see if you can make it more modern and more contemporary, i.e. different. But this one seems pretty nice, at least looking at it here. So famous throughout all the Ionian cities. So if we go back here, what we have here is famous throughout all the Ionian cities. That's so per Ionius urbes. So per Ionius urbes means through all the Ionian cities. And then they started with famous. So famous, fama, through all the, as you know, Latin often doesn't use the, Ionian cities. And of course, that's nice because per is followed by the accusative. So this is first declension, accusative singular, and of course, third declension, accusative singular. And then go back here, Tiresias. So here they have Tiresias. They don't give the name Tiresias, but that's the context. So ille means Tiresias. And then we still need to account for this word, which is superlative. So they don't even have, so notice in this translation, they don't even include that word, just because what it means is his fame having spread quickly throughout all the Ionian cities. So that, oops, if we look at the Celeberimus, just kind of look this up here. Oops. Yeah, so it's almost kind of like, so fama celeberimus, literally, it's almost like a poetic license. It kind of just giving it poetic emphasis of just how famous it was. But I think we can see, because I've seen this in other translations, the idea is that his fame having spread quickly throughout all the Ionian cities. And then we look at this here. Tiresias gave faultless answers. So this one I think we talked about. So we go back here. Literally was giving. So this is imperfect, and then faultless, irreprehensible, and then answers, responsa. So I kept it more literal, irreprehensible responses, but yeah, maybe faultless answer seems more idiomatic in 21st century American English. But then we still need these two words, and we said that this is in the dative, and this is in the dative too, but this is a participle. And so, two people who consulted him. So this is kind of the real gist of Latin, not the real gist, but one of the aspects of Latin that's so different than English is English uses an infinitive, rather an infinitive structure here, whereas the Latin just has two words, populo potenti. And I do believe earlier in the course, or certainly last in 201, we have dealt with participle constructions. So we put all together. You can see once we look at it right here, we can go back. And so I think it's probably, I would encourage you to print this out to have it next to you. And then here they have dusky liriope, the naiad. So if we go back to the original here, Kairula liriope, that's where they're getting. Now, what does dusky mean? Well, Kairula is, again, this is Ovid, so it's kind of silly. Ovid's like Shakespeare. It's kind of silly to use a dictionary to. But dusky in terms of blue, deep blue sea, blue sky. So it has this idea of the river. And notice how dusky liriopai, or has this kind of bluish tone to her features. Notice how that sort of merges or is metamorphosized. Remember, that's the title of the entire text. Is metamorphosized by the river of Cephisus, who of course changes the kind of blue that she is. And if you think about the act that Cephisus does, certainly I think blue or sad would be a kind of understatement of the violence that Cephisus imposes upon her. But still, that's the art of metamorphoses, is that blue can mean sadness, but certainly being very sad is when we experience something tragic. And certainly the river gods sort of fatalistic advances, if you want, that's kind of understatement, or actions towards Liriope sort of suggest how this Kairula, gets involved metamorphosis in terms of metamorphosis with this other language here. So dusky Liriope, the naiad, and again, you can look this up on your own in terms of what these figures represent in mythology, was the first to test the truth and accuracy of his words. So this is one that was a little bit tricky to translate the first time through. So she was the first. And so I mentioned when I give you your handout, you'll see that sumpsit. So was prima sumpsit. So she was the first to test. So temptima sumpsit means to test. And here they're saying the fide vocis ratai is, of course, this is where we get the word fidelity, which is kind of trustworthiness. And they don't have the word truth here, but his voice spoke truth. That's what an augur or a clairvoyant is. And so she was the first to test the trustworthiness of his voice, or as they put here, to test the truth and accuracy of his words. That is kind of the vocis quae. Let's see this here. Yeah, I'm looking at the book from which I'm going to make copies. Fide means trustworthiness, reliability, made trial of, put to the test. You'll see there's different ways to translate that group of words there. But again, I want to suggest that this can be very formidable if you're approaching this exercise as translation. It takes years and years. Imagine you're not a native speaker of English, and you're going to take the job of translating Shakespeare. Well, even for native speakers, the level of English one needs to have to be a translator of Shakespeare, that's years and years of hard study. You basically need to be a professor of English in order to even try that. So similarly, if we approach this as translating Ovid, we may find ourselves, a little bit the material over our heads. But if we look at it in terms of the image, I think it's a little bit easier to approach. That she is testing just how true his words are, that they've been seemingly ratified, or they seem trustworthy. And what is it that seem trustworthy? Of his words, because vox is third declension, so third declension genitive singular is is, so of his words. And as you know, you've had enough Latin by now to know that Latin often doesn't use his or her. So we go back here. Whom once the river god Cephisus. So let's see if we can match that here. So whom once the river god Cephisus. Now, we don't have river god here, but that's, you could just say Cephisus or the river god as well. That's who he is. So this one is fairly straightforward. Once we recognize, we just got to change the word order. So whom once, so quandam means once, the river god Cephisus clasped in his winding streams. This one probably, now this can be a little bit easier. So clasped, okay, in his winding streams. So flumine curvo means they clasped in his winding streams. And I'm looking in here for the notes I'm going to give you. Clausi can mean enveloped. Whom once the river god enveloped in his winding streams. So the idea of, this is where we get the word clause. A clause, of course, is some kind of enclosement. And so we've got to have this image of that he has her in his grasp, because he's the river god, so he controls the waters. As you know, water can be very powerful. And so he's not going to let go of her because he's using the powers and forces of nature to keep Liriope in his grasp. And took by force under the waves. So I think we talked about this earlier. And took, so that's the past tense of fero, so tulit, so F-E-R-O, like a ferry. So again, if we're unfamiliar with these, we have to simply, so if I look this up here, you can see here's our third principal part. So it means we got to translate as past tense. It means brought or carried off, under the water. Of course, you could also just type in this word too, but it's the same thing. Gives us your principal parts. So we got to recognize that we want to translate it in the past tense. So took by force. So V means force. That's third declension, accusative singular. And then in undis, remember, undis literally means under the waves, but so under the waves, they have that here. So took by force under the waves. All right, so I think looking at this translation here, especially printing it out side by side. So if we were in a regular classroom, I would print this out for you, and then we would have this on the overhead. So you'd have it side by side. It's much easier to make sense of when you use the comparative method. And this loveliest of nymphs gave birth at full term to a child. So let's see if we can figure this out. This loveliest of nymphs. So we'll go back here. Oops. Lost my spot there. Let's see. So this loveliest of nymphs here, Pulcherima nymphae. So Pulcherima is the pulcher, as you know, means beautiful. Here we have it in the superlative. This loveliest of nymphs gave birth at full term. So that's a nice phrase to help us out with this. So gave birth, we already talked about how that's what this means. So we got to recognize this as a participle. So we say put it in the past tense. So gave birth at full term. So literally, so from a full uterus sounds, kind of weird. So I like that. Gave birth at full term. So utero pleno. And here's a good example. If you look at older translations, they might not use that terminology at full term. It seems more modern medicine, but so little things like that can be helpful to look at different translations. So gave birth at full term to a child. So that one's fairly straightforward. This is our third declension accusative singular. Literally to an infant. So she gave birth to a child whom even then one could fall in love with, called Narcissus. So notice the punctuation helps us make sense of it. So whom even then, where are we at here? Okay, so whom even then. So that's yam. Yam literally means now, then. So whom even then. So qui means whom. Whom even then. And then here we have our subjunctive and then our past infinitive. Whom even then one could fall in love with. So whom even then it literally was possible to be loved. And then what was the name of this infant? Called Narcissus. So remember we put it back in the nominative form. And called Narcissus. And then we look at the last part for today's lesson. So that's kind of they broke it up a little bit differently, but I still like this idea of breaking it into sections. So this paragraph right here, it kind of continues a little bit with this idea. And then it says, de quo consultus, as you know, this is a participle of the second declension, so we got to translate it as past tense, as we got an indirect question here. So when he was consulted about him, that's kind of the literal translation, so literally about whom consulted. So as you'll see the context, Tiresias was asked a question about Narcissus. And so Tiresias was the one being consulted. The quo is referring back to Narcissus. And then here's one of the more beautiful lines in this part is whether he would see literally um, a long life and mature years. The fastidious father said, if literally, if he will not know himself. So put it more idiomatically, and then we'll look at the translation that they offer in that other text, is that the idea here is that Tiresias was asked whether or not Narcissus would live a long and happy life. And Tiresias responded, if he does not come to know himself. Now, as you know from the story, when he sees himself and his beauty in the pool of water, ironically, he comes to know himself. And of course, that's why he does not live a long life, because if he had not seen himself, he would not have been so attracted to himself, and he would have lived longer, but he ultimately dies young, because that's what youthful love often does. It can, you think about how many directions you could go with that, is it seems to, like Romeo and Juliet, there seems to be a tragic dimension oftentimes in youthful love that is in conflict with love of different kinds. For example, agape or Christian love, which is different than youthful or romantic love. So we got, going back to this, it says, being consulted as to whether the child would live a long life to a ripe old age. So being consulted, that one is simply consultus. So being consulted, in Latin just says consultus. So being consulted as to whether, now these little phrases right here, these are tricky because Latin doesn't have these words. We have to recognize as to whether, because of the imperfect form of the verb here in the subjunctive. So as to whether, on esset. So being consulted whether or not the child would live a long life. So de quo, I don't know why it's doing that. De quo is the child. So being consulted whether the child, or whether he, so de quo, as you know, de is followed by the ablative, second declension, ablative singular is o. So being consulted whether the child, and then here we have our future participle. So we go back to whether the child would live a long life. So literally would see a tempora longa. So here they have, this can mean to live as well, but literally would see a long life, longa, tempora, they both end in A, so we'll put those together. And then also to a ripe old age, literally, and also mature age. So they have to a ripe old age, which is kind of, this is the challenge of translation, is we got to come up with a more idiomatic translation. And then the seer, I said the fastidious, which actually is a word in English, but the seer, the old conscript, the seer, the fates, is referring back to Tiresias. And he said, what did he say? The seer with prophetic vision. So here they have, so that was kind of a free translation. So they're translating the seer with prophetic vision as fati dicus fates. So the seer with prophetic vision said, if he does not discover himself, if literally he will not know himself, because nov erit. So this is where you can play around where, again, this is Ovid, so using a dictionary is a little bit silly. People like Ovid create dictionaries. They don't use dictionaries. But nosco means to know, to learn, to become cognizant, to become familiar with. And so there's one of the bigger themes that emerges from this is the limitations of conceptual knowledge, or in today's age, the limitations of science, is there are human desires and there are things in life that don't explain rational explanation. And I think we all agree that in some form, love could be one such desire, that there's something, that you might describe as irrational in this entire story, but not irrational in that it's meaningless, but merely, I think Ovid's text suggests irrational because it's not reducible to some simple dogmatic method of science, jejunely understood. All right, so that was it for today. Again, we're not going to have time to get through all of this story. I sort of see ourselves maybe, getting for the final exam from 339 to 401. So it'll be this part right here, but in the Latin. So if we go back to that right here, 401, it is sound which lives in her. So this is what a beautiful phrase, by the way. So here, of course, it's talking about Echo, who dies from unrequited love. And the only thing remaining of her is not body, not soul, and certainly not love, but simply the sound of her lament for a love that she never experienced. So it'll be probably that you'll have to be responsible for the final exam. Oops, I went too far there. All right, so as usual, I know many of you are taking the final, not the final, but the test this week. So take a look at this video when you get a chance. And happy learning.